Okay, I think it's 12 o'clock. So we may have more people joining us as the minutes tick by, but I'm going to make a start. So welcome everybody to this Don't Waste Buildings seminar with Estelle Dehon KC. First of all, I just wanted to say briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with our group, who we are. So we're Don't Waste Buildings, a voluntary pressure group in the built environment, aiming to shine a spotlight on embodied carbon and really encourage the reuse of existing buildings, particularly in terms of generating new housing, but also for lots of other types of development that we think are not just environmentally beneficial because of the lower levels of embodied carbon associated with reuse, but also socially and economically beneficial. We started about 2 years ago with a different name and have sort of been working out exactly what our niche is within the built environment, but we've been growing very, very rapidly since last spring when we announced our name, Don't Waste Buildings, and launched on LinkedIn. At that point, we had about 100 or 150 people who were volunteering their help and support. And since we launched on LinkedIn, that has grown incredibly rapidly without any sort of marketing from us. And we're now, as of today, 1,451 people, which is absolutely incredible. My two co-founders are Leanne Tritton and Richard Nelson, and we very much value your support. On to today's session. We're going to be discussing last month's revisions to the National Planning Policy Framework. I'm sure almost everyone on the call is familiar with this document, but it's England's 82-page planning Bible, a set of policies really which guide how we plan the country's development in areas such as housing, transport and the environment. And the NPPF covers both the determination of planning applications and the local plan making, which is undertaken by individual planning authorities. Now, the NPPF is updated quite regularly, but obviously we have a relatively new Labour government. And in announcing these latest changes in mid-December, the government's spin was all about economic growth and housing delivery, building on the poor quality parts of the Green Belt, the so-called Grey Belt, and in what I regard as the crude post-Brexit political sloganeering that sadly seems to have been inherited from the last lot, defeating the blockers in favour of the builders. But today we wanted to drill down much further into what these changes really mean for the built environment, the UK's growth agenda and the climate. And we're lucky enough to be in the company of one of the country's most prominent and admired planning and environmental barristers, Estelle Dehon. Estelle is a public law barrister with a broad practice at Cornerstone Barristers and a particular expertise in climate change, net zero and energy infrastructure. In 2022, she took Silk and the following year founded the cross-disciplinary Centre of Excellence for Climate Litigation and Advice, Cornerstone Climate. So thank you so much for giving your support to Don't Waste Buildings, Estelle, and for joining us for today's debate.
Oh, Will, it's my absolute pleasure. And that I think Don't Waste Buildings is a very important initiative. So I'm very pleased to be here and pleased to be part of the group.
Thank you. And moving on to our discussion, I guess it might make sense for us to talk. Obviously, we're very keen to get questions in due course. So have a think about what you might like to ask as the discussion progresses. But I think obviously we're looking at these three different areas of change to the NPPF, and maybe we'll start with we'll probably major on the built environment because I think that's the area of most interest to the audience. But let's start with looking at economic growth, because obviously that was a big part of the headlines, generating growth. How would you characterize that, and what would you point to, Estelle, in terms of the big changes on that?
Sure. So just so people know, I've got like 100 different documents open on various screens, which is why I'll be looking left and right to have a look at stuff. I mean, really, there's been a very close connection in the mind of this government, I think, between building more things and that being growth. So building more housing, building more infrastructure, and just kind of generally getting building, quote unquote. And there are a few different aspects of the NPPF changes that are relevant to that. Obviously, the first key set of changes was about building more houses. And there were there was one big change there, which was really a change to the standard methodology. And then there was also a change about green belt versus grey belt. And that then leads into other types of infrastructure building as well. So I'll say something, I think, just general about the change to the standard methodology, because that's quite a big set of changes. And that, of course, is at the center of this idea of delivering 1.5 million new homes. Just as an aside, it's unclear the extent to which actually building 1.5 million new homes would address the actual crisis, which is affordability, not numbers of houses. But anyway, I put that aside. So until the change that took place in December, there was a standard methodology set out in planning practice guidance. And there's case law that tells us that the national planning practice guidance, which sits alongside the framework, which also sits alongside various ministerial statements that are made about planning, all three of those have the same weight in terms of planning policy. They're all material considerations for decision taking. So before the changes to the NPPF, there was a certain standard methodology that looked at projections for household growth over the next 10 years, and then looked at a baseline and put together a methodology for how many houses the authority was obliged to build, factoring in an affordability ratio. So all of that's kind of changed, and there's a new standard methodology under the NPPF that the government also published alongside a set of data tables that looked at how this calculation should be undertaken. And the baseline there has changed quite significantly. So there's a very significant set of changes about how you understand what your baseline is. And the upshot is that for most authorities, the obligation to build a number of houses is going to shoot up quite significantly. And that has implications, because throughout local plans and the National Planning Policy Framework, there are obligations to meet your housing targets. And if an authority falls very far behind their housing targets, then they get into a situation where the local plan is displaced and decisions are taken under the framework, and that tends to prioritize and permit more houses to be constructed. So that's the first big set of changes. The second big set of changes is around green belt versus grey belt. There's a new definition of grey belt land, and that's looking at from para 155 onwards in the NPPF. And that essentially takes what is green belt already and says, well, if building on it wouldn't undermine the purposes of the green belt, so you still have to have the purposes of openness, etc., etc., but it's sustainable, there's a demonstrable need, and overall it would be a lot, then grey belt land can be built on. And the key about grey belt is it doesn't contribute strongly to any of the green belt purposes. And that's going to, the suggestion is unlock land both for housing and for other types of development. And then finally,
poor quality green belt land, isn't it?
Poor quality, essentially poor quality green belt land. There's this whole set of tests about when something is grey belt and isn't grey belt. And the interesting thing is that just looking at the response on grey belt, I don't think anybody is satisfied. The development community has turned around and said the definition is too narrow. You still have to show that the land doesn't contribute strongly to the purposes, to any of the green belt purposes, which narrows it down much more than they thought it would. And then the others are concerned that land is going to be released, which is important for greenbelt purposes, but isn't necessarily recognized as such because it doesn't look great or whatever. So I don't think anybody's really happy with grey belt, and we're yet to see it really play out in a big set of decisions about what is and isn't going to be understood to be grey belt. But the idea is that it is there to make it easier to build on greenbelt land, build both housing and other types of development.
And didn't they say, Estelle, that they were going to try and more tightly define what they mean by grey belt this month? I don't know if that went ahead and they did that.
Yes, so there's been a lot coming out of the government this month, including announcements made on Sundays, which is not ideal. But I saw that there was a suggestion that the definition was going to be explained a bit more. I haven't looked at the planning practice guidance to see whether that's happened. I presume that's where they would do it. So if anybody on the call has seen that and wants to flag, that would be brilliant. But I certainly haven't seen that happening. I think probably because of the extent of the developer upsettedness about the definition, the response has been, we're going to be a bit clearer about what it means. A lot of the NPPF is in general terms, with the idea that there's planning practice guidance with a bit more detail underneath it. And that's the usual approach anyway. Yeah. And then, sorry, Will, just to say one other set of things about bringing sort of growth forward. There's been a clear indication in the revised framework about certain types of development that are going to be prioritized. And interestingly, data centers is a big one. There's a sort of various provisions which identify that data centers are going to be treated in a way that is positive towards their development.
So we could see a further boom in data center development.
And certainly the last few set of sort of big decisions that I've been seeing in the press has been all about big data centers. Not all, but there's been lots of big data centers that have been approved.
Sure. Anything more to say on economic growth? I mean, there's the 5-year housing land supply rules, aren't there, that have been restored?
Yes. And that ties into the standard methodology. That's why that methodology change is very important, because it ties into how the whole of the housing set of obligations are going to work.
Yeah. And if local authorities say to the government, this is unrealistic, we cannot do this, and if they say that in large numbers, what do you think happens then?
I mean, that's very difficult to know. We've never really been in a position where there's potentially been this amount of tension between the way that housing obligations work in the NPPF and what is thought to be viable with local authorities. So there were about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer than that, a set of cases that worked their way through the courts where people were testing the edges of what the housing requirements met. I think maybe the same might happen again. It might get tested through the courts. I can't see, because of how much emphasis has been put on 1.5 million homes, I can't see the NPPF standard methodology approach being rowed back very much. So I think it's all going to be about the extent to which authorities can establish, either through evidence or through legal challenge, that they get some sort of flexibility or exception. I mean, I should emphasize that any planning policy, and especially the national planning policy, the courts have said over and over again, it's a high-level framework. You know, it has to be applied with flexibility. It is a material consideration, but it's not the only one. For decision making, it's not even the main one. The main one is the local plan, if that's up to date. So, you know, there is a limit to what the NPPF can do. But because, as you say, it has often been treated as the planning Bible, it's seen as having greater force, even though actually technically it really doesn't as planning policy. It has the same force as many other types of planning policy. It does carry a sort of gravitational pull.
So, unless there's more you'd like to say on growth, maybe we should move on to the main topic of today's discussion, which is probably the built environment. Now, obviously, that's kind of overlapping with the other areas that we're going to be discussing in terms of growth and climate. But yeah, what would you say about the built environment element? I mean, just to start us off in this discussion, everything's still, in terms of that 1.5 million homes target, which has been endlessly trailed, the sort of underlying assumption within the NPPF and all the government's policy is that the private sector is going to deliver this 1.5 million, or almost exclusively, isn't it? And that therefore the profitability of housing development is sufficient to do that and to produce those numbers.
Yeah, correct.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, exactly. And as far as I can recall, there hasn't been any twiddling around with the notion of what viability means for deciding whether a development is or isn't viable. And so it is the case that the idea is that this is predominantly going to be private sector development that brings this housing forward. And although there are still affordable housing obligations, I don't think the NPPF changes have done anything to help the tension that often happens when there's a viability issue and the developer says, well, I can't deliver everything. So something has to give, and often it's affordable housing as a set of obligations. I mean, another thing that we didn't discuss, but which is going to have an impact on this, is that there's a new set of obligations around biodiversity net gain that are in primary legislation, but that now developers have to deliver. And what may start to happen is that those types of obligations, alongside of affordable housing, alongside of other obligations, become a long list of reasons why the development becomes unviable. And so things start to get watered down. And because biodiversity net gain is a statutory obligation, it may well be that affordable housing is a thing that starts to get watered down, which is literally the opposite of what is needed to address the actual crisis, which is an affordability crisis.
Okay. And in terms of, well, I guess because this is a Don't Waste Buildings debate, maybe we should get on to that part of the built environment question and what it does and doesn't say about embodied carbon and the circular economy.
Yeah.
Because I think, we've discussed in the past the possible implications of the M&S Oxford Street case and what that might mean for planning policy. But in this case, the government, or at this juncture, the government did not take up the opportunity to kind of clarify particularly well this area, did it, in terms of demolition and embodied carbon?
No, it's very interesting what has and hasn't happened with the NPPF changes. So for anybody following along in their own well-thumbed copies of the NPPF, we're going to go to paragraph 161 in the document. You'll see that the document doesn't say anything specific about demolition. It doesn't say anything specific about embodied carbon. And it doesn't really say much different than it used to say about reuse, which was not anything that was a sort of reuse obligation, but was, well, it was, we'll get there, it was a sort of minimal thing that was said. The interesting changes, and these are changes that were not necessarily trailed in the consultation version of the NPPF on which responses were given. The interesting thing that has happened is that there's a couple of new things that have arrived in the NPPF. So paragraph 161, which is the very first paragraph that looks at meeting the climate change challenge, now for the first time explicitly says that the planning system should support the transition to net zero by 2050. That was always implied, I suppose, but that was never explicitly stated before. And so bank that in your mind. The rest of that paragraph has changed a little bit, but just really sort of geeky details. So I won't go there. The next big change, the next big amendment is new paragraph 163. And that paragraph says the need to mitigate and adapt to climate change should also be considered in preparing and assessing planning applications, taking into account the full range of potential climate change impacts. That's a completely new set of phraseology, a very interesting set of words, because the consideration for mitigation and adaptation is in preparing, so it's on developers when they're putting their applications together, and assessing planning applications. Assessing, interesting word. Assessing usually goes to things like environmental impact assessing, but must also mean when a decision maker is considering whether to grant permission or not. So preparing and assessing planning applications, taking into account the full range of potential climate impacts. I can't see that that can be read as anything other than both embodied and operational carbon. That must mean, what can the full range of potential climate impacts be, and except both embodied and operational carbon, because that is the full range of carbon impact of climate change impacts, or that is included within the full range of climate change impacts of any development. So I think it's what's the right verb? A new obligation is one way you could put it, to undertake a whole life carbon assessment. Or it's certainly possible that authorities can start, as a result of 163, to ask for that more often. They can use that to bolster any current planning policies that require whole life carbon assessment. Obviously, there needs to be some sort of kind of reasonableness approach. So you wouldn't want a whole life carbon assessment for, a tiny development or an extension or whatever. But for anything that's even a little bit substantial, I think we're now going to get whole life carbon assessments which have to look at embodied emissions. Query also
I guess
whether
it could still be, developers' word against planning officials' word, unless, it's just frustrating, isn't it, that indeed this is a whole new paragraph that seems quite strongly worded, but it seems kind of slightly perverse that it hasn't gone into the impacts. I mean, have you got any thinking on why it doesn't define the impacts of upfront carbon, operational carbon, biodiversity, everything else it could be talking about?
So I have some thoughts about that, and I think it might be presentational. Because
it's more overarching, isn't it? The fact that it doesn't go into it in a way makes it stronger, funnily enough.
So yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that it gives the maximum flexibility and so probably the maximum strength to the paragraph. But presentationally, what it means is that there's no load of specifics that anybody can point to say, oh, look at this anti-development thing that has been included in the NPPF. What's been included is a broad, very, difficult to challenge in terms of reasonableness paragraph that just says take into account the full range of potential climate change impacts. And we wait to see what that means in terms of being fleshed out in guidance. And I was just double checking what, if anything, has happened to the climate change planning practice guidance, which was last updated in 2019, but some of it is still as it was put in place in 2014. And the answer is nothing, as far as I can tell. It still hasn't been updated to reflect any of the changes. So that planning practice guidance is super out of date. And you are right that while the wording in the new paragraph 163 is potentially very strong, what it doesn't do, unlike things like the standard methodology for housing requirements, which kind of over require a centralized approach. For this one, there's no centralized approach to how we would understand what is a proper whole life carbon assessment. When should you do it? At what stage in the development process? I mean, all of the things that came up in the M&S challenge and have come up are coming up in loads of other challenges. There's a challenge that's now on foot in relation to the Barbican, for the potential demolition of Bastion House and the Rotunda, the Museum of London. there was all sorts of analysis done about whether the whole life carbon assessment, which was undertaken in that development application, was done at the right time, was just essentially, things were taken off the table before the whole life carbon assessment was even thought about. Those sets of challenges are going to remain because the NPPF hasn't given us anything that helps there. Obviously, there's lots of guidance out there. There's RTPI guidance. There are people that are working on, and there's RICS guidance. There's people that are working on a sensible approach to whole life carbon assessment, and eventually it is going to come in planning practice, surely. But at the moment, it's something that is, it's going to be an area of discussion between developers and local authorities.
Yes. So this could come up, I guess, in planning decisions, in planning meetings and of the committee when it's actually deciding upon applications, and indeed in planning appeals. And I guess it's maybe that case law is the way that this is played out.
Yeah, correct. And authorities have an intersecting set of obligations here. So there's this paragraph 163 obligation to take this into account when you're looking at planning applications. And then there's also that 161 obligation to ensure that the planning system supports the transition, to ensure that the planning system shapes places in ways that contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. All of those existing obligations, bolstered by the reference to net zero, and then bolstered by 163, combine to make climate change a more important material planning consideration in decision taking. And that, in fact,
sorry, you finish your point.
Well, so that, in fact, in my view, just reinforces where the case law was already going. So there were a series of decisions by the High Court which essentially recognized that climate change was a material planning consideration, made reference to the fact that lots of authorities have declared climate emergencies. And so that as a material consideration had started to gain traction in case law. And I think this just reflects where that was going.
It's perhaps not quite the same as nature protection or wildlife protection, is it? Because I'm interested in this sort of disconnect, I guess, between this language that you rightly point to in paragraph 163, the full range of potential climate impacts, and the kind of political rhetoric coming from Starmer and Reeves, which may be, a sort of political thing that they're chucking it towards, certain voters and the right-wing press, which is, we're not going to let bats and newts get in the way of new housing. That would seem on the face of it to be slightly in tension with this new paragraph. Although
indeed.
Perhaps, this is purely about atmospheric climate change and not really to do with wildlife.
Well, okay, I'm going to take this leap and I'm going to share my screen. All right, hopefully you can see now. This is section 14, chapter 14, however you want to say it. And so you've got 161 there, which is the overarching one. You've got planning for climate change, which is what local plans should be doing. And if you notice there, planning for climate change includes a reference to biodiversity and landscapes. And lots of other things, water supply, overheating, drought, all of those sorts of things. So in terms of what local plans have to do, there is that intersection between climate and nature. And then you just get a general need to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Now, both mitigation and adaptation to climate change include, arguably, nature-based solutions, which would include addressing issues around biodiversity potentially, although there can sometimes be a tension there. And then there's the 164 paragraph, which again says that new development should be planned for in ways that help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through location, orientation, and design. Location is going to include potentially stuff around biodiversity as well. So
could be.
there's a
So I was
there's
just
a
going to say
little
that
bit
could
of
be quite
intersection there.
interesting for the design community, that paragraph 164B, couldn't it? Because that's all about how you design buildings and developments to consider climate impact.
Yeah, I mean it's very interesting, and we can talk a little bit later about design codes as well, because there's some interesting stuff that happened in relation to design codes. I mean, this is a very interesting paragraph, although it doesn't really help us, and I don't know if we're going to get onto the whole local energy efficiency issue. But I mean, what really jumped out at me is the second bit about local requirements for sustainability of buildings in plans reflecting government's policy for national technical standards. That is not necessarily clear, but it suggests to me the previous government's approach to try and stop authorities from putting in place standards that go further and faster than national standards. And that's going to tie back to whatever comes out of the Future Homes consultation and the Future Homes Standard, is my guess, even though, and this is being litigated in the courts at the moment, local authorities still have in primary legislation powers to set energy efficiency standards that go well beyond. I mean, I don't know what you mean by national technical standards, but certainly buildings regulations, they can set standards beyond those ones.
So we're going to continue discussing the built environment changes, but just to say, I can see that there are questions coming in, which is great. If people can vote on those questions, that would help me, because then I can see what the audience would most like Estelle to answer. So going back to the discussion of the built environment, I thought I'd ask you now, Estelle, a bit more about reuse of existing buildings, because there was a little bit, and it's maybe quite subtle, but there were a few interesting paragraphs on the concept of air rights and building on top of existing developments.
Yes, I'll share again.
It's called optoppen on the continent and increasingly here. So tell us about that, if you would, please.
Yes, so let me try and find it. It is 125, isn't it, that one?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. It's 125E. Yes, so standing back, and we'll get to optoppen in a sec, there are a few subtle changes in relation to the plan stage, first of all, which do seem to suggest a bit of an oomph for reuse of buildings. So if we start actually with B, planning policies and decisions, right? So this is both of them. Planning policies and decisions should recognize that undeveloped land can perform many functions, so that's quite useful. In terms of the biodiversity stuff that we were talking about. And often you'll find that existing buildings, that there can be undeveloped land around them. So that's interesting. And then we get E, which is the opportunities to use airspace above existing residential and commercial premises for new homes. And very often when you're looking at a retrofit proposal, in order to make the most of that redevelopment opportunity, applications will look to build up if they can. And that will often give opportunities for greater floor height, etc., that might not be in the redevelopment of the actual building if there are restrictions or floor height issues with the redevelopment of the existing building itself. And this suggests that upward extensions and that type of airspace use is in principle supported. And a useful thing that's happened is the removal of the previous wording, which looked about consistency with prevailing height, which doesn't really make much of it. I mean, that didn't really make much sense if you are looking to support building upwards. So now you can build upwards higher than the buildings around you, and that is in general supported by this little paragraph in the NPPF. So that I think is quite important. And if you team 125E with the paragraph 163 that we were looking at before on addressing the full carbon climate impact of the building, then that's quite a nice narrative supporting reuse of buildings.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of the we're going to get onto design codes as you said earlier, but in terms of looking at it in the round, as you say, there's quite a lot of encouraging stuff here, but arguably this doesn't really provide the clarity that the industry was calling for. I mean, I think both sides in the M&S debate sort of felt that you know, the last Secretary of State, Michael Gove, was pointing to the climate impact of demolition and rebuild, and was saying this is one of the reasons why he thought M&S Oxford Street's plans should be blocked. And you know, both sides thought this isn't well enough defined in the legislation and in the NPPF, and this doesn't really fully address that, does it?
No, it doesn't at all. And the difficulty that faced Michael Gove was that he read into this bit of paragraph, what was at that stage 159, a strong presumption against demolition. And the judge said that was basically reading words in that weren't there. Although I'd caveat that by saying that she never really looked at what radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions might actually mean, but that's fine. That was her view was very clear that he was reading words in that weren't there. The policy didn't mean that, and if he wanted the policy to mean that, then he needed to make the policy mean that. And a number of the responses to the NPPF consultation essentially said that they were, well, you know, they want this invitation has been given by the courts that you can make it absolutely explicit.
That we made for Don't Waste Buildings.
Yes, indeed. The one that was made for Don't Waste Buildings. There were a couple of other ones as well, which made exactly this point, which is we don't want to read these words in anymore. We can't. What we would like is for you to make it explicit, please. And that invitation has not been taken up. Instead, what we've got is the much broader, potentially stronger, but not as clear wording in paragraph 163.
Okay. What else was I going to ask you? Sorry, I'll just open my notes on the built environment. I think we've covered most of it. But before we get onto design codes and beauty, which is another interesting area, I guess overall, as well as the sort of lack of clarity that we've just explored on an embodied carbon and demolition and so on, arguably there's not very much on brownfield development and inner city development, despite, you know, what many people would say is the need for that with all these empty and underused commercial buildings in our towns and cities. You know, an outsider would say the government needs to sort of pull every lever it has if it wants to deliver 1.5 million homes. So the green belt and the grey belt, fine, we need that lever, but we also need the lever of infill development, brownfield development. But they're not really pulling that one here, are they?
No, I mean, we've still got the policies that support things like brownfield registers, and you know, authorities are told general stuff. And they are told, you know, use the full range of planning tools, including brownfield registers. But there's not loads. There is an obligation for local authorities to identify through the development plan and brownfield registers land to accommodate 10% of their housing requirement. But that's development plan and brownfield registers, which might mean development plan might mean grey belt identification rather than brownfield registers. So it's, although there's lots of general positivity around using brownfields, there's no specific obligations to focus there. For example, there's no kind of strategic approach to say brownfield first. If you bring something forward on brownfield, it's going to get a positive benefit in terms of getting planning permission, then grey belt, then so there's no kind of hierarchy either. There's just try and make as much use as possible of brownfield land.
Yeah. So do you think we're moving away from the brownfield first approach, because that has been sort of orthodoxy, hasn't it, almost, for many years, since the Urban Task Force made its recommendations under New Labour and John Prescott. So we're talking, 20 years ago, roughly, when that first came in, as, brownfield first, densify the towns and cities, and then other forms of development after that.
Yeah. So you see what it says about strategic policies, that they need to make as much use as possible of previously developed brownfield land. So, I mean, I wouldn't push it too far. I wouldn't say that we're necessarily stepping away from the previous approach. It's just, it's not there in as explicit a terms as one might have hoped.
Design codes, if that's all right, and beauty, which is been a bit of a political football in recent months, has vexed the term of beauty.
Yeah. So yes, there's been a bit of a step away in the NPPF from mentioning of beauty. There was, in the consultation on the proposed reforms to the NPPF, an indication of a potential switch in focus from local authority design codes away from a sort of authority-wide approach to more localized design codes and master plans, but that has not transpired. So paragraph 138 of the NPPF, in fact, just emphasizes the national model design codes. Let me share again. So here we've got, again, that authorities should ensure they have access to and make appropriate use of the tools, including the design code being the primary basis for preparation and use of local design codes. And there hasn't been that sort of fleshing out or emphasis on away from authority-wide design codes. There's been a very interesting set of discussions around authority-wide design codes. And I mean, I'm sure many on this call will be aware that there were some pilot programs that were put in place that looked to develop both kind of area-wide and some authority-wide design codes. And there hasn't necessarily been a great deal of success that has come out of those pilot programs. Although there's been a lot of useful learning, I think, that's come out of those pilot programs. And there are still kind of early design, like Pathfinder program, early design initiatives that are being taken forward. The indication that seems to come back from authority-wide design codes is that either it's too difficult to get something that works for a large area, and then it's so high level that it doesn't really help, or it becomes very complicated in the way in which the design code works. A very interesting suggestion that's been made, though, is that design codes don't necessarily have to focus on everything. And what design codes can do is they can focus on specific issues. And one of the issues that could be a focus of a design code, and there was one in the Pathfinder program that was actually looking at this, is to look at resource impact, to look at energy efficiency, to look at reuse, to look at sort of impacts on climate and nature. So it could be the case that an authority could put in place a design code with, for example, energy efficiency standards, space heating obligations, prioritization for retrofit rather than demolition and rebuild. All of that could come in the shape of a design code if it could be put together in a way that would make sense. And that's quite exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. But they're saying, although they're allowing or they're encouraging these pilot authorities to develop their own design codes and giving them central government funding to do that, they're saying, use the national model design code to inform this at all times, aren't they?
Yes. So that doesn't mean that you can't do something different from the National Model Design
Yeah.
Code. And interestingly, there's some quite useful stuff in the National Model Design Code about energy efficiency, which I seem to remember having looked at. Um, there's stuff around energy efficiency, energy hierarchy that's quite useful from the National Model Design Code. Um, and the National Model Design Code does say creating more beautiful places requires a greener approach with more energy efficient buildings, integrating with the natural environment and contributing positively to net zero by 2050. So that's a very helpful bit of the National Model Design Code. And you can use that as the basis for a kind of a focused design code that looks just at those issues. Or one could imagine that happening.
And going back to the beauty issue briefly, or the beauty wording, it's not been removed entirely, has it?
No, it
But
hasn't.
it's
No, that's true.
just gone down the pecking order quite a lot.
Yeah. No, I mean it definitely has. The so you do see the obligation to in terms of design to look at beauty, but it the previous to the previous set of changes really focused on beauty as good an indicator of good development. And I think that there's certainly been a step away from that. And you find beauty really being referred to mostly in terms of national landscapes and that type of analysis. So landscape issues rather than design issues.
Would you welcome that purely from a lawyer's perspective? Because I guess a lot of people make the point, which people can agree with or disagree with, that beauty is a subjective matter and therefore difficult to make planning decisions on.
Yeah. Um, it was interesting that what was anticipated would be lots of challenges around what beauty might mean. But it's also it is a matter of difference of opinion, but it is also a matter of planning judgment. And pure planning judgment is something that is quite difficult to challenge. Whether you're the developer or whether you're wanting to challenge the grant of permission, pure planning judgment, like something to do with beauty, is very difficult to challenge. So that really didn't happen as much, I don't think, as had been anticipated. Do I welcome I think I do, mainly because the thing that had frustrated me about the various amendments to the NPPF was that they seemed to be distracted by issues that weren't the central issue that the built environment needed to be dealing with, which is the nature and climate crises, to which the built environment is absolutely central. Like, we are not going to be able to address either of those things unless we get the built environment right. And those two intersecting crises also have a very significant impact on people, on human beings, on health, on welfare, on well-being. And that isn't going to be addressed unless policy is looking at those things either.
Takes us very neatly onto our third topic, and we will come to questions. I know people have asked questions, and I'm eager to put those to Estelle. But we're just going to deal with the third sort of main area of NPPF changes here, and that's climate. Now, we've already talked about some very important paragraphs: para 161, para 163, para 164b, I think, which is the bit that talks about the design impacts. But what does the new NPPF tell us about resilience, Estelle? Because that's really important, isn't it? How we're adapting buildings and places to deal with these extreme weather events that we expect to see more of.
Yeah. So climate resilience is really interesting. So there's a few things that that are new about climate resilience. So quite early on, in the set of obligations in the NPPF, I'll just share this again. So this is really early on. This is the early paragraphs, paragraph 24, which is looking at how local authorities collaborate and cooperate. And this is a very interesting little new set of wording in the duty to cooperate, which is looking at cooperating around climate resilience. So that gets a little push there. And then you get the retention in paragraph 164 of A, which was always there essentially in those words, about ensuring that we avoid increased vulnerability to a range of impacts from climate change. And note that it's implicit that development can still be brought forward and maintained in areas where there might be issues, for example, like floodplains, even though you're trying to avoid the increased vulnerability in relation to those things.
More sensible just to say we should try and avoid building on floodplains.
You know, my view is absolutely. I don't really understand. There are a number of things I don't really understand about why there's not more of a general reaction in people who buy houses to building that happens where they're vulnerable and they're on floodplains, and so they're obviously going to have issues, and where they, for example, are buying new houses which have gas boilers, which they're immediately going to spend tens of thousands of pounds retrofitting. I don't understand why those two things are not a national scandal, but anyway, they aren't. And instead, what we've got is wording which makes it absolutely clear that development can be brought forward in areas which are vulnerable, but you just have to do the best.
And what do they mean, do you think, by, we know what sustainable drainage systems are, I think, but what does, in this regard, green infrastructure mean? Presumably that doesn't mean renewables, it means
nature-based solutions.
Nature-based solutions, right? Yeah.
That's what I read that to mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because there's a whole set of other things. I mean, we haven't touched on it because it's not really the focus of this group, but there's a whole set of other things which have been encouraging onshore wind farms and encouragement for renewables and encouragement for grid upgrade and all of that. That's quite important, obviously, for climate change. But that reference there to green infrastructure, I think, given that it's looking at vulnerability and adaptation, must mean nature-based solutions.
Estelle and audience, I'm very sorry, but I stupidly didn't plug my laptop in. I thought it's fully powered and it'll be fine, and now it's telling me that the battery saver is on. So I'm just, if everyone can bear with me for 30 seconds, I'm going to go and get a plug and make sure that you don't lose your host halfway through this. So yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. What I might do is, just while you're doing that, mention one of my favorite paragraphs, which is touching on both climate and nature-based solutions, which is the emphasis that trees make an important contribution to absolutely everything, character and quality of urban environments, and can help to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And that the emphasis on new streets being tree lined, taking the opportunities to incorporate trees into development, etc., etc., etc. All of that, I think, is pretty important in terms of giving a positive benefit to trees and tree planting. And the key thing that backs that up is securing long-term maintenance of newly planted trees, because there's been at least some evidence that planting goes in and isn't properly maintained, and then it's kind of worse. You don't get the benefit of the tree, and then you get the disbenefit of the dying tree. So this 136 is one of my favorite paragraphs.
Okay, I've now got power again, so that's good.
Good.
So yeah, we were obviously discussing resilience. Maybe we've
Yes.
covered that. Um, what else are
Yeah,
we
I
going
mean,
to talk about?
you can say something a little bit about the sequential test of flooding. That's still in there. Requires the taking into account of current and future impacts of climate change. There are new paragraphs, so it's 173 to 177, which flesh out what the sequential test of flooding is and should do. We'll see whether that has any impact on the permission or the grant of permission for housing development, in particular in flood risk areas. And then there's some really geeky stuff about the definition of sustainable drainage, which could be quite useful. So I just note that.
Yeah. Okay. What about biodiversity assessments? Obviously, that's slightly different to biodiversity net gain, isn't it? But environmental groups, I think, including the UK Green Building Council, have called for biodiversity assessments on every development. And at the moment,
Yeah.
that doesn't happen. And this new
No.
version of the NPPF does not mandate that, does it?
No, it doesn't. No. Um, I wish I could sit here and tell you that I thought that that would be the direction of travel. But going back to the rhetoric and why it actually does make a difference, and if what is being done with the rhetoric over the last few weeks around environmental protections being a block to growth and to development, and around all of those stupidities being swept away, if that is just political rhetoric, it's very unhelpful, because it will undermine any direction of travel, for example, for requiring things like biodiversity assessments and impacts assessments coming forward.
Okay. Well, let's move. That's sobering thought.
Sorry, but
Well,
a
it's
nice
true.
thing.
Words have an impact, don't they?
Yeah, words have an impact, but
Yeah.
biodiversity net gain is still an obligation, and there are lots of interesting things that are happening around that. And I'm just going to give a super quick naughty plug to a book that my lovely colleague in Chambers, Nina Pindham, who is literally the authority in this country on biodiversity net gain, has written all about biodiversity net gain obligations. It's small, it's brilliant, so I recommend it. It's out now.
We'll look out for that. So yeah, we've got some questions. I'm going to take one from Ellen Willis to start us off. And she says, there's a significant knowledge gap, as planners are often not climate literate enough to know what makes a development more or less sustainable.
Yeah.
So without this knowledge, the concern is that they may be at the whim of developer greenwashing.
Yeah.
Has there been any discussion or work done in response to the new NPPF obligations about increasing climate literacy within the planning system? I mean, this may not be something that you know about, Estelle, but it's a good question.
I mean, it's an excellent question. And so in the budget, there was an indication given that there was more resource being put towards planning. And one of the things that was suggested that might be used for is training. But there's no obligation to make the training a climate-focused training. Exactly this point is the reason that you find other bodies starting to step in to provide training that is aimed at local authorities, including, but not limited to, Cornerstone Climate, where we've been trying to do that type of training. But it is a difficulty. It is a problem. There are some authorities that are well enough resourced to have climate specialist planning officers, and I've worked with a couple of them, and that's a game changer in my view. But other authorities are not going to be able to do that, and it's going to be difficult. For development, to the extent that environmental impact assessment is still a thing that is needed, for development that is going to be subject to that obligation, And there's going to be environmental outcome reports which will replace environmental impact assessment, and there's still, I think, going to be an obligation to do this. Authorities are going to be required to have sufficient expertise to judge whether the assessment is done properly. That is a current obligation, and my guess is that's probably still going to be a future obligation. To the extent that climate is covered in those reports, they have to get outside help to help them. That's, sorry, where a long sentence is going. Authorities have to get outside help to help them.
Yeah. And obviously, one thing that we've written about at the Architects Journal quite a lot is this public practice program and body, which you may be aware of, that started within the GLA and then has expanded out in recent years to a national level, where architects and other design professionals, many of whom are very climate literate, go and work in the public sector, often in planning departments. So that's a very positive move, I think. A related question from Simon Sturgis, who many of us know well as an inspiration behind this group. And Simon asks, presumably another key issue is the lack of planning officers to process whatever is proposed. Now, in the announcement of these updates to the NPPF in December, I think the government said it was going to fund an extra 300 planning officer posts, so that they're clearly aware that there is a resource issue. But as well as the expertise of the planning officers involved, it is perhaps also a question of numbers. Do you think there are sufficient numbers at the moment, Estelle?
No, no, not in all authorities. Sorry, I knew this was going to happen. I've managed to avoid the dreaded lurgy for the last few months, but not now. So
you can go and get a drink of water if you like.
I have like 1,000 drinks of water.
Oh, here. You've had 1,000. Yeah, that's not helping.
No, it's all right. It'll come back.
Okay. Yeah, so probably more work needed on the resource side. Because I think for a long time there's been a sort of observation that there is perhaps just too much reliance on private. You talked about the expertise provided by others to planning departments. They need their own expertise as well, don't they?
Yeah, it's a big problem.
Yeah. A question from Lucy Jenkins, and I'm not sure quite how this fits in with the NPPF, but it's something I know we've discussed in the past, which is she asks, is it likely that projects which adopt the new pilot version of the UK net zero carbon building standard may be well placed?
That is a lovely question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a lovely question. I don't know. And it does link back to what we've just been discussing, right? So the more that your planning officers are climate aware and climate literate, are aware of the standard and are aware of all the work that's being done to support the standard, including all the work on viability and supporting that as a viable approach to development, the more likely I think it's going to get support. The interesting question will also be the flip of that question. What happens when you've got development coming forward, when you get a group, for example, of objectors saying you haven't used this standard, this is a very climate impactful development, that should count against you, you shouldn't get the benefit of support from the National Planning Policy Framework, go away. It will be very interesting to see what happens there. But yeah. I definitely think that the emerging standard is very credible, and I would imagine that it would be very useful and helpful for development to say that it's complied, or a proposed development to say it's complying with that standard.
Yeah, because you see that, don't you, in other certifications that are quite popular, particularly with larger property developers and investors like BREEAM or LEED.
Exactly.
They love these sort of badges that they can put on a scheme and say, this is another reason to give us planning. We're sort of best in class.
Yeah, exactly so. And there's so much credibility to the way that the whole project of putting that standard together was undertaken and the sort of testing of it. Yeah, I'm quite excited.
Yes. Another question from Simon, who's asking about paragraph 161 and what it says about reuse of existing buildings. Now, I haven't got the document in front of me, but I'll take this as read that paragraph 161 says that the reuse of existing resources, including the conversion of existing buildings, should be encouraged. Now, again, this kind of takes us back, doesn't it, to language and how strong the language is, because to my mind, that is not strong enough to actually have much of a material impact on this sector. I don't know what you think.
I mean, it's all to the good, right? It's useful that it's in there, but this is the type of wording that if you tried to read in a presumption against demolition, you would have a problem. You'd run into an M&S problem, right? So what this will do, I think, is definitely give positive planning support to retrofit schemes, for sure. And that, including and taken together with 163, would definitely do that. The question is whether this wording and 163 would be sufficient to see off a demolition-led scheme. And I think if the demolition-led scheme has a whole life carbon assessment and a set of viability analyses supporting it, it would start to get challenging.
Yeah. But I guess there may just be a kind of risk aversion that kicks in, having seen what happened with M&S Oxford Street, and then the sort of slowly updated NPPF, which is going in a circular economy direction. I think we'd agree, even if it's going too slowly for many of us. It may just be that many developers don't want the risks of running into this, and therefore, do take a decision not to go down the demolition route. Not to say that demolition and rebuild isn't profitable. Clearly, it can be very profitable. So that's going in the other direction. But would you say that, taking a step back, the M&S saga, even though it went eventually in M&S's favour, plus these latest changes, are going to be, quite important in terms of encouraging reuse and discouraging demolition?
Yeah, that's really interesting as a question. It's difficult to know the answer to that. I think the awful truth is...
Because M&S sort of present it as, we had a rogue Secretary of State, he went a bit mad, absolutely crazy, anti-development, anti-business, thankfully we're now back in better sort of territory.
I think there's a certain element of the development community that will read M&S as supporting business as usual. And then there's another element of the development community that will read it in the other way, that will say exactly what you've just said, which is this is going to remain a difficulty. There is the change that is coming. We're seeing it being trailed in planning policy. We're seeing local plans coming forward with much stronger support for retrofit and for reuse first. And I think they're seeing the writing on the wall. So I don't actually think, I think this is going to, whatever your position was before, this is going to entrench it.
I'm going to ask a question from one of my fellow co-founders, Richard Nelson, who asks, if a developer builds houses on grey belt land, will they still need to meet affordable housing targets? And if so, would they not just try and do commercial instead, if that is allowed, such as data centres, as you noted, which are supported in this?
So one of the aspects of the grey belt definition is that there needs to be a demonstrable need for the type of development on that land. So that might give a boost to housing development on that type of land in an area where the authority can't demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply, in an area where the housing delivery test is below 75%, all of those things. That would be supporting of the building of housing development on grey belt land. For other types of commercial development, though, there may equally be an ability to show the need for that type of development, but it will all hinge on whether you can or whether the developer can evidence that.
And I think they slightly relaxed the affordable element, didn't they, for grey belt development? Saying that it was up to the local authority to set that, rather than saying it has to be 50% affordable. Which I guess they feared would have stymied some development. This is an interesting question from Michael Dring, who says, do these NPPF revisions make building carbon stranding more or less likely, either that estates or buildings are invested in, reuse, demolished or sold on? So will the changes accelerate change?
That's a very interesting question. I don't think planning policy in general has got to grips with stranded assets yet, but I think it's going to have to come, because we're going to start seeing it. It's starting to be much more of the narrative, interestingly, around fossil fuel development, not surprisingly, because it's pretty obvious which assets are going to be stranded there most quickly. But it hasn't, certainly in my experience, I mean, I'd be very interested to know if others are starting to hear stranded assets being talked about more in relation to buildings. But in my experience, it's not really, it hasn't become part of the discussion yet, and it definitely hasn't been reflected in how people understand planning policy. And it should be.
Yes. So interesting question from JJ Lorraine, who's part of our group, and he asked about the Heathrow green light that Rachel Reeves has given today. He says, will today's decision to expand Heathrow lower planning authorities' ambition for sustainable development? Will they be worrying less about the bats and the newts? And will that speed up planning, in your view?
Heathrow is a difficult one, because you'll remember there was a whole airports commission that looked at where there should be expansion in the southeast in terms of a new airport, and Gatwick and Heathrow both made submissions, and I can't remember whether there was another one. There was another one, wasn't there? Anyway, it was mainly Gatwick and Heathrow.
Oh, it was the Thames. It was the Thames Gateway proposal.
Yeah, it was the Thames
Lord
Gateway
Foster
proposal.
And others. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. There was the three, and Heathrow won. And the Airports Commission was very clear: if there's going to be a new runway, it should be Heathrow. And then that's kind of languished there, as then other regional airports tried to expand around it, because that development was going to take a long time. So Heathrow coming forward is just technically a decision that's already been made, being rubber stamped. But the question is, what is the mood music that rubber stamping happening now in this way with this language is going to be communicating? And I fear the answer to that is, we want growth, we want development. We see more development as the same as economic growth, even though that's not necessarily true. And we're not going to let sustainability get in the way of that.
Yeah. Okay. Angus Aldridge asks, an interesting one. Could an argument be made that a new build, rather than regenerating an existing building, has less of a carbon impact, taking into account the whole life carbon or the whole life of the building's impact? That must depend on how long a building lasts, question mark. Some 1980s build is now not fit for purpose. What do you say to
Yeah,
that?
you hear that argument made for sure. And I mean, Simon is the person to answer this question. It really is about how you do your whole life carbon analysis and whether you do it well. Be circumstances where the whole life carbon analysis would support a new building rather than a reuse. I imagine that might be feasible. But my experience of those types of arguments being run is that they are run in circumstances where there's been a fiddling around with the whole life carbon assessment in order to make it work to support demolition when otherwise it wouldn't. Yeah. And generally, the difficulty with the extent of embodied emissions, because there are, I mean, it tends to be by far the biggest area of the carbon footprint of a development. It makes it very difficult for a proper whole life carbon assessment to come out with anything other than reuse as the better option.
Yeah. But of course, it is possible, isn't it, to do an exceptionally good new build that has, relatively low embodied carbon for a new build, and equally to do an absolutely awful retrofit,
which, for sure,
is very carbon heavy.
Yeah, absolutely sure. I mean, that's very true. And material sourcing for your new build is going to be absolutely crucial, because you can source materials that are very low carbon indeed, that are reuse of materials, so not necessarily reuse of the actual building that was on the land, but reuse of materials from elsewhere. So that it's absolutely true that new build can have a low carbon footprint, and retrofit can sometimes not be done very well. Definitely that's the case. It's more all generalizations are going to have exceptions.
Yeah, it's a rule of thumb, isn't it? And a general sort of direction that that we're sort of proposing with Don't Waste Buildings. Another question from Lucy Jenkins. Could green infrastructure also indicate accessible green space, i.e. health and well-being resilience?
Yes. Yes, because there's a really interesting reference. Now, where did I make a little note about this? There is a really interesting additional reference to health, which I think is quite important. And I can't remember which of the set of notes that's in from the various pieces that I put together for preparing today. Yeah. So, yeah, where is it? Is it 162? It might be 162. I definitely think that is right. Yes, here it is. Share.
So you're sharing your screen, actually. That's really good.
Yeah, so it is in the planning section. But if you look here, it says policies should report appropriate measures to ensure future health and resilience of communities. Right? Health is new there. Future health and resilience of communities, such as providing for physical protection measures, etc., etc., etc. So definitely that reference to health and resilience of communities and infrastructure to climate change impacts, I think, is recognizing that intersection between a lot of the adaptation and resilience measures being good for well-being as well as being good for health. And it's a lot of the arguments around proper insulation, proper energy efficiency, proper green spacing, proper integration of nature into development is as crucial for health as it is for climate and biodiversity.
Yeah, and does it say much, or is there much change in the NPPF to what it says about modes of transport? Encouraging walking and cycling as opposed to car use.
I didn't pick up on loads of changes there, but there
Well, I haven't
may
either.
be. But
Yeah.
I certainly didn't pick that up. And indeed, I'm I'm involved in a legal challenge at the moment. Oh, it's so ridiculous how things happen. The last government, in its push to emphasize that it supports drivers because it thought that was going to be a vote winner, made something called the Plan for Drivers. And at the same time as they put the Plan for Drivers in place, they took away a set of guidance, which was super geeky guidance under the kind of national traffic management obligation, which was supporting active travel. And I'm involved in a legal challenge that's challenging the lawfulness of taking that guidance away. It has not thus far been met with a great deal of optimism from the courts, but it's sitting with the Court of Appeal at the moment, so we'll see what happens. But certainly there's been a bit of pressure on the Labour government to bring that guidance back. But as far as I can see, that hasn't happened. In terms of NPPF changes, I didn't pick up any.
Question from Simon Sturgis. We are going to probably run out of time for questions. It's great that they're coming in. But I guess this is a question about op-toppen, which we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
Simon points out that building on top of existing buildings is carbon efficient, provided you don't overstress or significantly alter the existing structure.
Right.
If you go too high and need significant structural changes, you get to the point where you exceed the carbon cost of new build.
Ooh, that's interesting.
So there is still the issue of resource use and waste, which new build is not good on. Were you aware of that point that we need to be a bit careful about op-top and overstressing the existing building underneath this new development?
I was not. I'm very happy
No, I
to hear from
wasn't.
Simon. That's really, I mean, that's super interesting.
Yeah. And another one from Lucy. Let me just find. Sorry, just lost the question here. Oh yes, here it is. Estelle, is there any clarity on when the Water and Flood Act, Schedule 3 SUDS, that's Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems, may become mandatory?
Love it. Oh my God, that's a super geeky question, and I'm here for it. The answer
This
is
does link across biodiversity, climate, and resilience via nature-based solutions.
yeah. I mean, the answer is I haven't heard anything.
These are very, very well-informed questions, as you'd expect from
Wonderful.
the Don't Waste Buildings group.
Yeah.
I think we're probably almost answered them all, or you've almost answered them all, so that's brilliant. I'm just seeing if there any more have come in. Here we go. There are some more coming in. Tyler Goodwin, who we know as well. Is there absolutely nothing in the NPPF, Tyler asks, that obliges planners to adjust their affordable housing conditions to support viability? The greatest issue right now is 35% affordable housing makes development unviable, which is why affordable housing starts are down 88%. Draft plans to require 20% of GIA for affordable homes for affordable offices in Camden could lead to the same fate. So
Yeah.
I guess he's asking if there's new stuff in the NPPF on this particular matter.
Certainly not that I picked up, and I haven't picked up that under any of the other things that came out, for example, around the evidence base for the standard methodology, or in planning practice guidance. I haven't picked up that there's been a change in that regard either. The interesting thing that I have been picking up, though, in relation to affordable housing is that sometimes it's pitted against, like the viability question becomes, and I think I mentioned this, what do you want? Are you going to give away on affordable housing in order to get that 1 or 2% more expensive development, which is or a net zero building, or aren't you? And certainly the anything where there's a decision in relation to the way you have to take into account the London plan, the indication has been that you have to prioritize affordable housing. And so if there's something on the viability spectrum that is giving you difficulty with that, then you prioritize affordable housing, not the other way around. But I certainly haven't seen loads on the NPPF and changes in affordable housing and what viability means there.
Okay. Tyler's got a follow-up question which you may or may not be able to answer because it's a particular case. Can Estelle comment on the legal challenge relating to Ram Brewery, where the developer has said that 35% is not viable and needs to be reduced?
I can't, mainly because I don't know much of the detail about it. That's very interesting.
Yeah, sounds like one that we should all know more about. But
yeah. Thanks for flagging that. That's something I'll have a look at.
Thanks, Tyler. Matt Mahoney asks, how can we encourage accountability in terms of compliance with the NPPF obligations on carbon or environmental matters?
Yeah, so if I take that to mean once you've got development that's come forward, which is saying that it's going to do stuff, how do you make sure that that transpires? And that has to be through good conditions that have monitoring obligations. And there's actually some really interesting work that's being done, and I think also as part of the new green building standard, about making sure that what is put in place does what it says on the tin, essentially.
Okay. Well, we're nearly out of time. So thank you so much. It's been a really fascinating session, Estelle, and great to see the numbers we've got and the number of questions. Really engaged audience, which just shows how much interest there is in this topic. I just had one sort of final question that I'd like to put to you, which is, obviously we know that the NPPF does change. It's it's constantly being thought about. It's constantly, there seem to be consultations on how it should change, and then the changes that the government have brought in will be replaced by new iterations. So what should we expect in that regard? What is next for the NPPF? Where's it all going? That's maybe quite a sort of general question that's difficult to answer, but I just wondered if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult to answer. I think that there's my worry is that the various consultations that have been announced recently are looking at trying to step back or step away from some of the habitats protections. And I wonder whether, because there's actually quite strong wording in the NPPF around habitats, Ramsar, vulnerable landscapes. I wonder whether that might start to be in the crosshairs. But I hope not. I hope I'm wrong. But if I was to guess, that might be where I would say it would go.
I'm picking up on a question from Richard Nelson. Do you think the government needs to sort of pit growth against climate, if that's what's going on? We were talking about the
obviously not
earlier, weren't we?
It's just idiotic. I just don't understand it. I mean, it's so unhelpful on so many levels, and it's just not right. There is a certain amount of degrowth or anti-growth change, which is part of a climate narrative, in the sense that lots of consumption of energy and goods and services is difficult for the climate.
Raw materials.
Fine. Yeah. Yes, and I get that. But this suggestion that somehow development-related growth and climate are at odds is just not right. And the interesting thing that I did see, and I know we're kind of near the end, but the interesting thing that I did see, which kind of went under the radar, is that with the whole 1.5 million houses, there was I think it was called a design council. There was something that was put in place which was going to look at how they're going to deliver those houses in a way that doesn't completely blow the climate obligations. So they are at least thinking about how the intersection of growth and climate actually and addressing climate actually works. But this constant narrative of the two things being antithetical to one another is A, unhelpful, and B, just wrong. And it's very depressing. And one hopes that, they're going to turn over a new leaf.
We'll make the argument that, this kind of development that is sustainable can lead to growth. And sometimes you can have win-wins and win-win-wins. That's what we try and do with Don't Waste Buildings. So this has been a brilliant
It's a
session.
really positive narrative. There's so much that's positive around that narrative and around developing jobs. And anyway, you all know.
Well, I'm getting lots of messages saying people have really loved this talk. So thank you again, Estelle. It's been brilliant. And thank you to the audience for joining us.
Thanks, Will. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks, everybody. Lovely to see you all.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.